Hello.
Hello.
My name is Alex.
I'm Val.
And we're here to talk about Season 5, Episode 2 of The Sopranos.
Yes.
Matthew Weiner's debut.
Matthew Weiner.
So, if you like Mad Men, obviously he's the creator of that show. Now he's on Team Sopranos. And...
Well, he was on Team Sopranos before he was on Mad Men.
This is him. This is his writing debut, though, on the show.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a distinct feel to it. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about this episode.
You want to talk about Wieners?
No, I want to talk about Rat Pack.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about Wieners.
Cool.
It's not that kind of podcast.
Okay. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think the title, this is a classic example of the title really playing into one of the main themes within the episode. So, Rat Pack, we see this portrait, as Tony calls it, modern art, given by Jack Mazzarone to Tony, and we see Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and there's this focus on the Rat Pack.
Right.
Interestingly, I think that if I had to come up with kind of a theme...
Who's who in the Rat Pack?
I wasn't thinking about that. But if I have to think about... I did think about that for a little bit, actually. But I abandoned it. As he gave it to him, I was like, okay, well, Sammy Davis Jr. is on Jack Mazzarone's side, but...
Adriana's a woman.
I dropped it. I dropped the whole line of reasoning. But what I was thinking about is how there are multiple rats and there are multiple informants, and there's quite a bit of focus on all of them in this episode. So we have kind of a rat pack around the Sopranos family of Ray Curto, Jack Mazzarone, and Adriana. So for me, in some ways, that kind of does reflect the image that we have of the three members of the actual rat pack, because we haven't seen to this extent the FBI as an institution like we do even in the beginning of this episode, of them kind of like in their workplace environment, new agents kind of coming in, the way that it's working, Ray Curto's relationship with his FBI handlers, and the fact that we're seeing now Jack Mazzarone as an informant, Adriana obviously as an informant. There's a lot of threats to the family coming from these rats. Yeah. And it's interesting how people interact with the concept of the Rat Pack with Dean Martin throughout the course of the show, and also with the idea of an informant or a Judas, as Rosalia Priel calls them. So it's interesting to see Adriana and how she's dealing with these issues that she's going through and turning on the family.
Yeah. So, I mean, they all kind of are, like, all three of the rats, right? I am still kind of caught up on who's who in the Rat Pack, but I haven't come out of it yet. But they certainly kind of all have different stories, at least. And we don't know them, but we can imagine that they've all kind of come to this for different reasons and in different ways, right? Yeah. We know the most about Aid because we've seen that story. We don't know when Jack Mazzarone... Right. Started working with the FBI. We don't really even get Ray Curto's, right? This is kind of the first insight we're seeing into like him actually interacting with his guys. So it's pretty interesting. Adriana's having a really hard time.
Yeah, we see her kind of coming a little bit undone right now.
Yeah, like I think like the thing with the FBI warning on Citizen Kane is really good. They linger on it just long enough.
It's interesting how they linger on the things that are obviously unspoken parts of their life. The FBI warning, the concept of the Godfather, and none of them really wanting to deal with it. And the fact, even the way that they analyze Citizen Kane, they read this kind of incredibly simplistic review and they say, oh, the cinematography was great, and oh, it was Rosebud all along. But there's no analysis underneath the surface. It's just like a viewing. They seem bored. They're basically falling asleep.
Yeah. Well, my favorite line for someone who likes colors is when that one woman who we don't know who's there says, "Oh, is it in black and white?" And we have black and white so much in this TV show, and you know, and we get a lot of conversation about kind of like good and evil in this episode as well, right?
Right.
Like we have the conversation between Adriana
And Sanseverino.
I mean, actually, like the FBI warning is in black and white also, right? Like it's this like clear defining like this is a crime and this is not.
This even on the jury tampering saying, well, now he's a felon. There's a lot of
Yeah. We have Jack Masserone talking about how he thinks his mother's in hell at the beginning of the episode.
We have Tony to Tony Blundetto, who are basically supposed to be best friends and brothers, and yet at one point in the episode, he's saying, fuck him, the guy is fucking useless to me.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of like immediate turning and people needing things to happen for them.
Yeah. I was more referring to the black and white part. Too.
Right, but there's kind of like a simplicity or kind of like an on again off again relationship with a lot of topics. So I just thought that was really interesting and like you said, like the really amazing write-up that they read on Citizen Kane. It was like I forget exactly what it said. It's
but
a masterful movie with masterful
yeah.
music and cinematography.
Yeah. And I like when afterwards Carmela's like, well, there was the cinematography.
Ah, yes. The cinematography.
And they were like, that was very good. So I think we do. Like, we have, like, we grapple as viewers with the good guy, bad guy thing, right? Like, it's actually pretty hard to be on the side of these FBI agents because they're kind of dicks.
Right.
You know, the ones who I guess were Jack Masserone's handlers, right? Like, we don't know who they are when we see them get stopped in the car, but they're kind of like...
It's nefarious. I love that first scene. So they introduce the episode. We have a first scene in the rain. There's this like intimidating car that just kind of pulls up in a way that for me makes it almost be associated to a criminal.
Totally.
And yet it's actually the FBI.
Totally.
And yet it's also a little bit confusing because we don't know these characters. I actually kind of was like, oh, is that Agent Harris? It kind of looks like Agent Harris. But then I was like, oh, maybe it's not the feds. Like, you don't really know who they are.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. And then it's connected to Adriana shortly after that in the next scene.
We see her in the rain.
Also in the rain in a car.
And, you know, and we know her scenario, but that is how we're kind of connected. And then only do we really get the full picture when we see that mail cart, you know, rolling down the hall of the FBI headquarters.
Yeah.
Where we see the connections between all of these things. And we see, like, the hat that Masserone was wearing on the table and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, it is, it's a lot. I mean, Adriana is really grappling with that, right? Like, she does want to feel like she's doing good, but I think it's funny, like, even like in her work with the FBI, like, she's kind of using it for her own personal gain, right? By like telling information about Tina, right? So she's not on the side of the good guys. Who is? Well, I know, like, that's the thing, right? Like, sure, like, is that a crime what Tina's doing? Probably, right? But like, Adriana's not doing it so that she's like improving the world around her or anything like that, right? Like, she's doing it for her own personal
I think there's
reasons.
a secondary theme in this episode, and that's people doing things in ways that just benefit themselves. People being oblivious to the concerns of others and only really caring about themselves. There's a line of Tony while he's on the phone with Tony Blundetto saying, "It doesn't affect you, but it affects me." And I think that is a theme of this episode. We see Adriana doing it. We see Tony doing it. We see lots of people doing it. And we actually see Tony Blundetto getting out of prison, wanting to go straight, having ideas of how he can change his life, and nobody cares. Nobody wants to support it. Tony continually brings up the airbags, you know?
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, actually, because in that last scene with Adriana, as she's talking and bringing this up, we see airbags very clearly in focus on the window outside. They actually like make sure that we can see the word airbags, which comes into this scheme that's brought up many times in the episode, this airbag scheme that Tony wants to get Tony Blundetto into, which is, it's really interesting.
Yeah. Tony's face when Tony B says that he wants to be a massage therapist is really funny.
Yeah, it's good. Well, I also like Tony saying, you know, I leave for fucking 1 hour and it's a goddamn slumber party.
Yeah.
And yet also there's maybe a tertiary theme in this is like Tony, we see him sometimes reflecting on the past in an idealistic way in terms of his relationship with Tony, his dad being able to vet people on the spot. And yet there's this, now he's an adult, and yet there's this very childish dimension to him. So him talking about, oh, it's a fucking slumber party, and yet right after that he goes outside, takes Tony Blundetto, and berates him for saying, you don't make fun of me.
Yeah, it's very childish.
And there's also between him and Carmela, we should be able to settle this like adults. That's from Tony.
Yeah.
And Carmela says, stop taking my shit out of the house.
Yeah.
So there's Tony trying to be an adult, and yet not, acting extremely childish.
Yeah. But that,
I can't make words
but
today.
that kind of goes to the black and white too, right? Like it's these like polarities. It's like you're either an adult or you're a child. You're either a good guy or you're a bad guy.
Right.
You're either in or you're out, right?
Yeah.
Like, and Tony B, like, he's kind of like hanging around Satrials and stuff like that, right? Like, these are the people he knows.
Yeah.
But he doesn't want to be in, right?
Right.
We don't see characters like that in this
Yeah.
show, right?
Right.
Like, you kind of can't have it both ways in this world.
Right.
Although we have these characters in this episode, all these rats who are in and out at the same time too, right? So these polarities aren't really that useful because they don't describe anybody or anything, right? Like you never have someone who's totally in or totally out. You never have someone who's totally good or totally bad.
Yeah.
You never have someone who's an adult all the time,
Yeah.
who never acts childish.
I think that's very astute. Yeah. And it's, it's interesting because I think Tony wants to break it down into a simple dichotomy of good guy, bad guy, be able to tell, is Brian a Judas? And he says, he comes back after discussing how his dad could read these things. He says, what the fuck am I, a mind reader?
Is Brian a Judas?
Did I say Brian?
Yeah.
I meant Brian Mazzarone. Jeez, I'm glad this is a two-person podcast. This was just me, I'd say the
Brian.
craziest shit. Yeah.
Brian.
Brian Mazzarone. I'm sorry, I probably do this all the time with Jack Mazzarone. But like there's an inability to be able to be clear cut. Even though I guess right after that they come on, they're like, oh, he said I'm
I lost some weight.
because I've lost some weight, and I guess they do correctly figure out what's going on, but it's very difficult to kind of break things down into these categories. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about one of the last scenes, Tony with the Rat Pack modern art piece, putting it up at Livia's house, but then turning over the religious symbols?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I've been trying to make sense of it a little bit. I don't know why.
In the last 5 minutes.
In the last 5 minutes since the episode ended. We actually came in here pretty quickly today, too.
Yeah, I got to go after.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know about the turning down of those religious symbols and what that could possibly indicate. Like, it couldn't, like, Tony couldn't have it. And there's stuff about being at your mom's house in this episode and moms in this episode, too, that I kind of want to go into. But there's something about those things that don't quite fit together for Tony. And he tries out this Rat Pack modern art, quote unquote modern art, on one wall, and that doesn't really work for him. And then he tries it on the mantle, and it doesn't see. He has to turn down these like pictures of the Virgin Mary, in order for it to be there. So I don't know, like something to do with Tony. Like I feel like it's more like Tony's solidifying where he stands, right? Like that he's kind of like, I don't know.
Well, I think that there's kind of a imaginary idealization of what the Rat Pack stands for that's associated to the mob, that's associated to Las Vegas, and that's associated to a concept of masculinity. And I think it's kind of a do whatever you want, get whatever you want, be respected, be one of the boys, be part of this club. And like you said, I think there's something that doesn't seem to be at place with that, to have these religious images, especially religious images coming, from what I think were coming kind of from like a female domain. They were of the Virgin Mary, right? So to not see that and to be just engaging with a kind of simplistic read on what he wants, this imaginary kind of realm of masculinity and fun and just kind of getting what you want sort of thing. Yeah, or seeing men a certain way, or like a group of people a certain way. Now the irony is that he's seeing the Rat Pack this way, and yet this show is making a connection to the people that are being Judases.
I know, and that's why I was actually going to ask you, like, were any of those guys connected to like law enforcement? You know what I mean? Like,
well, I mean, Frank Sinatra and the Mafia. I
know. I'm asking, were any of them connected to like the FBI or law enforcement?
Not that I know of. Yeah. If there's any experts out there on the Rat Pack and the FBI, send us your findings. We're interested.
Yeah. No, there's something about, like I said, there's something about them being at their mom's. So like both Tonys are actually living at their mom's right now, right? And again, going back to that kind of like child and adult thing, like they're both like, Tony B's living in his basement, his mom's basement. Tony's living in his dead mom's house, which I figure they would have sold it by now, but I guess it's still there. There's something about kind of this, you know, and the talk that the women are having about the divorce when they're watching the movies. Like, there's something being said here, I think, about like the capacity to kind of be an adult when you're engaging with this group of people who don't know how to behave like adults, right? Like, it kind of brings you down into this, I don't know, like more childish level, right? Like, you're getting so upset that someone's teasing you. I don't know. There's something to that for me.
There's also glimpses into examining the relationship between that generation and the generation beneath them. So their kids. So there's the scene at Artie's, the Tony Blundetto, where he comes back, where they're saying about Bobby Jr., they let that kid say anything. And then it's interesting because that's right after Janice and Bobby leave, and they have this commentary on those kids and the way they behave. And then immediately after that segues into Meadow and AJ walking up. And then there's irregularities there. There's kind of examples of ways that Tony and Meadow are having some kind of like some problems amongst themselves that haven't really been resolved, and some issues there in terms of an appointment to see each other, these kinds of things. Then there's also Kelly, Tony Blundetto's daughter. So this concept of being a parent, being a child, rearing children to do the right thing is very complicated. And it seems to be that in this world, most people have major issues in it.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. There's definitely a lot in there. Yeah, I thought it was interesting how we had "How's Kelly" being asked twice, right? Like, Tony Soprano first asks Tony B's mom that.
How is Kelly?
How's Kelly? She's not good. They're getting a private investigation. Maybe she's with Harpo. We see the Kelly tattoo on Tony B's arm, right? So we just I don't know, we're already kind of like getting insight into how Tony B is different from Tony S. Yeah. I also feel like I'm like a kindergarten teacher when I call when you call kids like by their
Tony
first
S.
initial.
I like Tony Uncle Al. Tony.
Well, that was interesting too, right? And like how that connects all these children and how they are connected to their past generation, right? And then he goes into that weird story about, Tony Uncle Al, or no, whichever Tony who died.
Yeah. Tony. Oh, right. That's right. Yeah. And
the third Tony that he mentioned.
The dead uncle, right. Yeah. But it's funny because then after that, he starts talking about how everybody's died and is dead. Yeah. Then he says, "You're back for good," which is like this desire for something, this desire for Tony Blundetto to be around and to negate the death of these past generations and this past family connection. Now, for me, there seems to be kind of like a foreboding aspect to that statement of him kind of following this speech into Never Never Land, talking about dead family members and then saying "you're back for good." Yeah. There seems to be some kind of something like off-putting about it.
Well, we do have a lot of death in this or like talk of death in this episode too, right? Because we have Carmine who dies. And well, I guess like death and blood, I guess, and like family kind of blood, right? So like because the thing about Tony and Tony is that they are blood cousins, right?
Yeah.
And you hear him talk about like, say like, this is your uncle, right? This is your uncle.
Yeah.
And they're like, we've never met him before, but it doesn't matter, right? Like
Right.
that's your uncle. But when Carmine dies, we see Lil Carmine, getting upset with people focusing on Johnny Sack, right? And there's a comment like, he thought of you like a son.
Right.
He's like, well, I didn't really mean it that. Like he
Right.
didn't like,
He
he was
kinda
just
takes it
saying
back.
it. He
He
was on
revokes it.
on his deathbed. But you see the difference then between like how Lil Carmine is being treated versus how Tony's talking about Christopher. He's like, this is my nephew, Christopher, right? To that woman Shylock. What's
Yeah.
her name?
Oh,
Listen with an L.
Lorraine.
Lorraine, that's
Yeah.
right.
Lady Shylock.
So we see these differences here in like, what it means to be family and what that kind of like passing things down means.
Yeah.
I don't know how, like, who was related? Was it Johnny Soprano and Tony Blundetto's dad who were related? Like, how are they actually
Right.
cousins? I don't
Good
know.
question. I mean, because that seems to be so loose sometimes too.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
guess so.
they had a picture of Livia up on their wall of their house,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
anyways, I don't really know, but there is this like, again, Tony Soprano's desire for Tony Blundetto to be back in things
Yeah.
does also tie back into that blood
Mm-hmm.
relationship. There's also something like Tony's really feeling sensitive about, right? Like when he's watching that World War II documentary,
Mm-hmm.
and he's feeling really emotional hearing about this guy whose
Yeah.
friend went over the bunker or whatever, and died kind of protecting him, kind of thing. And we know that there is like a history behind why Tony Blundetto went to jail, and
Yes.
why Tony Soprano didn't, right?
Yeah. And interestingly, actually, he starts watching that History Channel immediately after the spat between Johnny Sack and Carmine Jr. And there's a cut to like an explosion. Like they're
Yes.
fighting and it's like boom. And then
Yes.
we watch Tony watching the History Television
Yeah.
Network or whatever. So there is this relationship to relationships
Yeah.
and to family relationships.
Yeah, although like Tony doesn't really react when he hears that Carmine dies, right? They get that call at Junior's house, right? And Tony doesn't really react.
Everybody seems pretty
Yeah.
loose about it. They say he was a genius, I guess.
I guess so.
He invented point shaving.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, and we were talking about phones a lot in the past couple episodes, it's really important to Tony, our Tony, that he gets Tony Blundetto this phone.
Mm-hmm.
And the phone has a We Are the Champions ringtone.
Mm-hmm.
But like, and he calls them whenever he wants, like
Right.
at 3 a.m.
Even
or
though he
whatever.
says that it's so that he can call him whenever he wants.
Yeah. So there
And we've
was-
talked a lot about phones on the show
Yeah.
and connectivity. So it's an interesting thing that he wants to be that connected to Tony Blundetto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like there is this like, technically open line of communication, although they can't say certain things because it would impact Tony, right? He couldn't say like you're the boss over the phone.
Right. Even though
Right.
he does.
Well, he does. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing about death that I thought was, it was right. It was during that scene where they get the phone call about Carmine dying, is that we have Junior talking about this game, Crack the Whip, right? And it's I imagine it to be kind of like a childhood game, right? And he describes it like you're all holding hands, like you're all linking arms with someone and like moving fast, and then suddenly there's a break in the chain and you go flying off, kind of thing. And I thought
Right.
that was like an interesting analogy for that, like that you kind of don't know where these breaks in the chain are going to happen,
Right.
or when they're going to happen, but like suddenly you're flying off into this space.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's like a child game, I don't know. Anyways,
Yeah,
Junior's
there's a
thinking
lot
about
there.
death. I thought it was
It's
it
an
was
int-
very like that was like a very how do I say it? Like, this is not a criticism, but it's like one of those moments in Sopranos where you're like, okay, they're sending a message here.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like a typical way that people talk with each
Right.
other to kind of do these kind of metaphorical
Yeah.
spiels.
It's an interesting episode because I feel like there are like multiple domains that they're examining. There's like these like multiple thematic areas that are all happening kind of at once, but they're all kind of related and they're all connected. It's interesting. And maybe that's like we're seeing a new writer too. Like there's a slightly different style.
Yeah.
It comes across a different way.
Yeah. The other thing, just to tie, into some of the things we've talked about in terms of death stuff, we have Tony driving over a bridge to throw that Rat Pack poster into the water.
So he ultimately decides that he doesn't want it.
He doesn't want those rats.
Yeah. Right.
Or he sees it as something that was like a tool to get something else, right? Like he kind of like, it's not a real gift, I guess.
Right.
Bridges we have associated with death.
Death, yeah.
And he throws it into the water. It's also a very rainy episode, so that now makes me also think about like wateriness, right, and what kind of the rain indicates. It's almost like the opposite. But then we have this talk of hell, right? We have this rain, but we have talk of like moms like being in hell. We have Tony wearing that Tabasco shirt. So they are
as one does,
as one does, and we do have episodes where we've had kind of references to the devil and hell and stuff like that before too, and like we have this kind of like fire and water counterpart going on here. And then I'm just thinking about like turning down the religious posters. I don't know. So that we're building up a collection of symbols that I think are bringing us somewhere this season and next season.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. We have a bunch of new characters. I mean, we saw Lorraine that you were talking about. Garepe, we see. Tony Blundetto is a new character, which for me is so fascinating because, and we talked about this in the season opener, but we're in episode 2, and yet this is Tony Blundetto's introduction.
Yeah.
So already Feech Lamanna's been kind of established as a character, and that's even referenced.
He's already making money.
He's already
back on his feet. Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's some pretty incredibly efficient writing, that he's already been established as a character. We know who he is. We know who these people are. Tony Blundetto comes in 2. It's really interesting. It's not what I would have expected. It's probably not the predictable way to write in a new character, to bring them in the second episode.
Yeah.
But they use that form very well, and they, because of that, can have other characters who now have some recognition with us that they can relate to in interesting ways. I think it's just very, very well done and not normal. I think it's done in their own way.
We see really Phil Leotardo.
That's right. We just see him.
Yeah.
That's
He's
great.
at the funeral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, making an appearance since Goodfellas.
Yeah, exactly.
I had some interesting lines and stuff and some thoughts.
Yeah.
One is just Adriana kind of falling apart. So, and her use of alcohol. So
and her friends letting her drive her car.
Well, that's one of them for me. Yeah, the fact that she's feeling uncomfortable because she feels comfortable in this space. Rosalie talks about a Judas going to the Last Supper and doing this to his friends, knowing what he did. There's an aspect of Adriana stumbling away, getting in her car wasted. That who are these friends? The fact that they let her get in the car and drive goes to show me that they actually aren't great friends or great people.
And they reference Angie Bonpensiero, right? Like, I think it's Aid who's like, why isn't Angie here?
Yeah.
Right? And they're like, oh no, like, you know what Pussy did.
Yeah.
So they like drop her.
Which isn't even accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Adriana, we hear a conversation between her and Chris saying it would be nice to get some support at the house without you drinking, which you would hope that Adriana would be able to, I guess in her own way, be able to drink or something. I don't know, whatever. But maybe that is the right thing to do, I guess, to give some space to somebody in recovery. But even outside of that question, there is an aspect of Adriana's actually abusing alcohol in this episode. Like there's that scene where she's getting hammered with her friends. But even in that moment, she's bringing wine to bed. That's a pretty strong move to be bringing full glass of. It's nice.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
She was wearing also cut off shorts to go to bed, so
Yeah.
it didn't seem like she was like going to sleep.
I guess
like
so.
she was
I
like-
guess so. You're right.
Yeah.
There's another scene though, later on while they're watching the
Yeah.
movies where
She's,
you
like,
see
pouring
Carmela
more.
talking and you
Yeah.
can see the way that she's pouring.
Yeah.
Rosalie references it. So we can see her having her own vice, which is something that could be a problem as she spirals out of control, much like Christopher had a vice in drugs, and that
Right.
was kind of his own undoing.
Why does she have this shitty friend who's, I guess, dating Lil Polly? Tina?
She's weird, that girl. Why would she talk like that in front of Adriana?
I don't know, but
Well, she's done.
yeah.
There was an interesting scene too amongst Adriana and her friends while they're talking about Citizen Kane. I think it's Rosalie says that guy had all that stuff and still died alone, and then the camera actually changes to a focus on Carm, which is clearly a major point of concern for her. She is always kind of acquiring things, made this pact with the devil to get stuff in return for moral kind of ambiguity in terms of how you live your life. So it's interesting how they will all die alone in that way, and the stuff will not protect them.
No.
And yet they're kind of protecting themselves from these concerns through stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of making them confront that, which is interesting how they're all watching movies, they're having film club, and yet some of these great movies, David Chase can recognize that it confronts you with these larger questions, and that's the art of them. And yet that's the last thing that they want. They just want to watch something because it's supposed to be good. And there's an interesting relationship with art, which also kind of comes back to Tony too.
Yeah, totally.
Characters' relationship to art, how they engage with it, how they want to see it, how they want it in their homes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, I like how they watch Citizen Kane and have nothing to say about it. Then they skip.
What is there to say?
They skip Casablanca because I guess the equipment was missing.
Right.
Right. And the next one is The Godfather, and we get the sense that they're not going to watch The Godfather together. So
they're on
I don't
to
know
number
what's number 4. But.
Yeah. We have Junior. There's a couple just small things in the writing that are interesting that kind of imply that he is repeating himself and kind of actually maybe does have some aspects of the dementia that are referenced in his court date. Repeating about eggs. Tony says, "You've told me about the cremation 4 times." There's a lot of like little things like that he's letting slip.
Yeah.
That are definitely not dwelt on, but also imply certain things about his mental condition.
Dwelt.
That's not a word, is it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Dwelled?
Yeah.
Dwelt.
Or dwelled upon.
Dwelled upon. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah.
I just
Dwelt.
fuck up words.
It's a good word. It's a good word though.
Dwelt. DWELT.
I like it.
I learned a new word today.
Good.
The other really interesting one I had was very close to the end. Tony washing his face, looking in the mirror. And after he washes his face, there's a great shot where it really looks like a tear is going down his face. And he's looking at himself in the mirror and dealing with who he is.
Yeah.
And then we see him, the camera actually goes from another vantage point where we see him in the restroom, much larger than he was when the show started, in his boxers, pretty overweight at this point. Which has been referenced in the show. Jack Mazarone saying, "Have you lost weight?" Everybody knowing that's not true.
Yeah.
Talking about.
But we've also seen Tony through it. Like whenever we see Tony at a doctor's office, he always weighs himself.
Yeah.
Every time. That's like where we always see him. So there is like, I think there's something like bigger about Tony and his weight. Too. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
No. Yeah. Well, I mean, he's growing, obviously, in stature and in size, but there's something about Tony having to deal with who he is and who he's becoming right now. He's on that path to dying alone.
Yeah.
He has no wife.
Well, we don't see him with any of his Gumars or anything like that.
He's
this
very
episode.
isolated.
Yeah.
Even his greatest, oldest
Just
friend
in his dead mom's
is
home.
almost immediately been pushed aside by his behavior and his
Well,
actions.
and we get a very short scene with Artie, right? His other oldest friend.
Yeah.
Who
And they're not
they
friends
don't even
anymore.
Talk. They don't even. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we see, as he washes his face, this kind of sadness represented in the shot that they construct.
Yeah.
I love this season. It's amazing.
Yeah,
I subscribe to the odd numbered seasons of
You like
Sopranos
the odd
being
number?
really, really something, and this one is no exception.
Season 5 is really no exception,
It's a good one.
and it's crazy if you've watched it before thinking about where we start and where we end up.
Yep.
But we're only on episode 2.
It's just crazy. Like, it starts right here, and you have these existential crises. You have these dwelling questions of nihilism, and then at the end, they just all figure it out.
Yeah.
And it's just they're all just friends again.
Yeah.
And the FBI is gone.
Everyone's alive.
Like the FBI and the mafia, they're all friends, and nothing's illegal. They've all gone straight. They all start working at the carnival.
It's so good.
It's really nice.
It's such a great.
And then 6 and 7. Like are
6A and B.
Yeah, well, I think that's 6A and 6B. I mean, it's just such a different show because they're just all so, happy. And,
it's like a sitcom kind of.
Yeah, and there's that unicorn character. That's nice. Yeah, the talking unicorn.
Yeah.
So, this is kind of the end of the existential examination of the show.
Right. Yeah, we're done now. But yeah, well, stay tuned, I guess, for that. If you have a moment and you use iTunes to listen to our podcast, or even if you don't, if you could give us a rating or review or both.
We appreciate it.
Both would be great. We would appreciate it. And
helps people find the show.
Yeah, feel free to shoot us an email or whatever.
We love talking about Sopranos.
We really do.
Anytime, any day.
And we otherwise just talk with each other. So
yeah.
Well, we have some other people that we talk to as well. But
yeah, a few.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening.
See you next episode.
Bye.